morning stiffness is not what you think it is. The lower back refuses to straighten. The hips lock at the angle the mattress imposed. The ankles creak through their first 3 steps. 8 hours of supposed recovery produced a body that moves worse than it did at midnight. The stiffness concentrates where the body was most still. The hip pressed into the mattress is stiffer than the hip on top. The shoulder that bore weight is tighter than the one that faced the ceiling. The pattern is entirely positional, not pathological. And the stretching you do to relieve it, the 10 minutes of pulling cold, rigid tissue into positions it resists, is tearing the tissue at the microscopic level, replacing flexible fascia with scar tissue that will be stiffer tomorrow than what it replaced. The stiffness is a physical state change in a lubricant, a fluid that sits between every fascial layer in your body, a fluid that was liquid at body temperature during the day and gelled to a viscous adhesive overnight when the temperature dropped and the movement stopped. The morning struggle is the mechanical resistance of muscles trying to slide past tissues that are glued together by a lubricant that solidified while you slept, and the physics of ungluing them, a property called Thixotropy, requires a specific sequence that the standard morning stretch routine violates every single day. Why does a body that spent 8 hours recovering move worse than it did at midnight, and why does the stretching that temporarily relieves the stiffness make it permanently worse? Between every muscle in your body, between every organ, between every fascial layer that wraps and separates and connects your internal architecture, sits a lubricant. The substance is hyaluronic acid, a long-chain sugar molecule that your body produces specifically to allow tissues to glide past one another during movement. When you turn your torso, the muscles of your abdomen slide over the muscles of your back. When you flex your hip, the quadriceps glide over the femur inside a sheath of connective tissue. When you reach overhead, layers of shoulder fascia slide past one another in a coordinated sequence that produces the fluid motion you experience as a simple arm raise. The fascial system is not passive wrapping. It is the largest sensory organ in the body by surface area, containing more mechanoreceptors per square centimeter than skin. It reports stretch, compression, and shear to the central nervous system in real time. When the fascial layers are gliding freely, the mechanoreceptors report smooth, low-friction movement. When the layers are gelled and adhered, the mechanoreceptors report restriction, and the nervous system interprets restriction as stiffness, tightness, or pain. The morning stiffness you feel is your fascial mechanoreceptors reporting that the surfaces they monitor have stopped sliding. Every one of those gliding surfaces is lubricated by hyaluronic acid, and the viscosity of that lubricant depends on 2 variables. The body controls continuously during the day and abandons completely during sleep: temperature and mechanical shear. At body temperature, 37 degrees, with regular movement providing continuous mechanical shear across the fascial surfaces. Hyaluronic acid maintains the consistency of light oil, thin, fluid, and frictionless. Muscles glide past one another without resistance. Fascia slides over fascia without adhesion. The system operates so smoothly that you never notice it. The lubrication is invisible because it works. Specialized cells called fasciae, identified by Stecco and colleagues as a previously unrecognized cell type in 2018, distinct from fibroblasts in both morphology and function, sit along the gliding planes between fascia layers and secrete hyaluronic acid continuously. Their sole purpose is to maintain the lubricant supply at the interfaces where tissue must slide. The fasciocyte is plumper than a fibroblast, with a central nucleus and a location precisely along the plane where 2 fascial layers meet. It produces hyaluronic acid using the enzyme hyaluronin synthase 2, the same synthetic pathway that produces the hyaluronic acid in your skin, your joints, and your eyes. The molecule itself is a long unbranched polysaccharide chain, thousands of repeating disaccharide units linked end to end, forming a molecule that can be several million daltons in mass. At low concentrations and body temperature, these chains remain separate, hydrated, and slippery. At higher concentrations or lower temperatures, or when the fasciocyte population has declined with age, concentrating the remaining molecules into a smaller total volume, the chains begin to interact, forming weak, non-covalent crosslinks that transform the fluid from a thin lubricant into a viscous gel. The transition is nonlinear. A small decrease in temperature produces a large increase in viscosity, following an Arrhenius-type relationship where the rate of molecular interaction accelerates as thermal energy decreases. During sleep, both variables collapse simultaneously. Core body temperature drops approximately 1 degree, a small number that produces a disproportionate effect because hyaluronic acid viscosity follows a nonlinear relationship with temperature. The viscosity increase between 37 and 36 degrees is sharper than the increase between 38 and 37, as Kalman and colleagues characterized in Frontiers in Chemistry, demonstrating that the gel transition accelerates at lower temperatures. The temperature drop alone would increase the viscosity, but the second variable amplifies the effect dramatically. Movement ceases. Sleep is the longest period of sustained immobility in the 24-hour cycle. 7 hours without mechanical shear. 7 hours without the continuous sliding and gliding that keeps the lubricant thin. Without thermal energy and without mechanical agitation, the hyaluronic acid undergoes a state change. It gels. Fluid that was liquid during the day transitions from sol, a flowing solution, to gel, a semi-solid adhesive. The gel binds adjacent fascial layers together. The interfascial spaces that were lubricated and mobile during the day are now stuck. Your hip flexor is glued to your iliacus. Your thoracolumbar fascia is bonded to the erector spina beneath it. Your plantar fascia, the sheet on the sole of your foot, has gelled against the underlying muscle layer, which is why the first steps of the morning produce that characteristic stiffness in the arch that loosens after 5 minutes of walking. Gel transition is not instantaneous. It develops across the night. After 1 hour of stillness, the viscosity has increased, but the lubricant is still semi-fluid. After 3 hours, the gel is forming at the surfaces where the fascial layers are pressed together most tightly. The weight-bearing hip, the compressed shoulder. After 6 hours, the gel has set throughout the entire fascial system. Every gliding surface in the body, from the superficial fascia beneath your skin to the deep fascia surrounding your organs, has transitioned from lubricant to adhesive. The stiffness geography you feel in the morning is the map of which surfaces were under the most compression for the longest time. Those are the surfaces where the gel formed fastest and set hardest. The top shoulder, which had no compression load, may have gelled lightly. The bottom hip, which bore your body weight for the full duration, has set like concrete. But if the gel is the problem, what does it take to reverse the state change, and why does stretching fail to do it? Now ketchup sits solid in the bottle until you shake it. The shaking breaks the weak molecular bonds that hold the semi-solid structure together, and the ketchup flows. Stop shaking and the bonds reform. The ketchup returns to its semi-solid state. The property is called Thixotropy, from the Greek thixis, touching, and trepo, to turn. A material behavior where a gel becomes liquid under sustained mechanical agitation and returns to gel when the agitation stops. The physics is molecular. The weak hydrogen bonds and hydrophobic interactions between hyaluronic acid chains that form the gel structure are easily broken by mechanical shear. The energy required to break them is small, far less than the energy required to tear tissue. A gentle lateral sway generates enough shear force to disrupt the gel bonds. An aggressive stretch generates enough force to tear the fascia before the gel has liquefied. The gap between the force required to melt the gel and the force required to tear the tissue is the window the first minute must operate within. Enough to stretch, not enough to stretch. Ketchup is thixotropic, paint is thixotropic, quicksand is thixotropic, and the hyaluronic acid between your fascial layers is thixotropic. Gelled after overnight stasis, liquid under sustained mechanical shear, gelled again after the next extended stillness. The morning stiffness will return tomorrow morning because the thixotropic state change is fully reversible. Gel when still, liquid when gel again when stillness. It is physics. The ketchup analogy teaches the shear dimension, but ketchup does not need temperature to flow. Your fascia does. Honey earns the second dimension. Cold honey is rigid. You can invert the jar and the honey holds its shape. Warm the jar in your hands and the honey pours. The viscosity of honey depends on temperature in the same way hyaluronic acid viscosity depends on tissue temperature. Lower temperature, higher viscosity, slower flow. The jar of honey left in the refrigerator overnight does not pour until you hold it under warm running water. The water provides thermal energy. Your hand rotating the jar provides mechanical shear. Neither input alone is sufficient. Warm honey that sits still remains thick, cold honey that is stirred remains resistant. You have felt this asymmetry every morning without recognizing it. A hot shower loosens the body partially. The heat reduces viscosity, but does not break the gel bonds. Walking in the cold morning air loosens the body partially. The shear breaks some bonds, but the low tissue temperature keeps reforming them. The shower plus the walk accomplishes what neither accomplished alone. The fascia needs both inputs simultaneously: thermal energy to lower the viscosity, and mechanical shear to break the gel bonds. One without the other produces an incomplete state change. Warm tissue that remains still, lying in a hot bath without moving, reduces viscosity but does not break the gel bonds. Moving tissue that remains cold, stretching immediately upon waking, applies shear to a gel that has not been thermally primed. The gel resists. The tissue must go somewhere. And what happens next is where the physics turns destructive. What happens when gelled fascial layers are forced to elongate before the lubricant has melted? Lead layers are asked. The hyaluronic acid between them is still in its gel state. The layers are glued together by the molecular bonds that form during the full overnight stillness. Instead of gliding over one another, which requires the lubricant to be liquid, the layers pull against the adhesion. The adhesion holds until the mechanical tension exceeds the tissue's tensile strength at the microscopic level. The tissue tears. Micro tears in the fascial matrix, not visible to the eye, not acutely painful in most cases. The tears are too small to trigger a sharp pain response, though they contribute to the vague aching that many people attribute to getting older. The repair response that follows is the same response the body deploys for any tissue injury. The body deposits collagen at the tear site. But repair collagen is different from the original tissue. Aligned fascial tissue has collagen fibers oriented along the direction of force: parallel, organized, flexible. Flexible. Repair collagen deposits in a disorganized matrix, randomly oriented fibers that do not align with the original architecture, as Langevin and colleagues documented in the Journal of Cellular Physiology, describing the fibroblast response to mechanical disruption of connective tissue. The repair timeline runs 3 to 5 days. The inflammatory phase clears debris in the first 48 hours. The proliferative phase deposits new collagen over the following 3 to 4 days, and the remodeling phase gradually reorganizes the fibers over weeks. But the morning stretch routine repeats daily, tearing the same tissue again before the previous repair has completed. The fibroblasts are depositing new collagen on top of incompletely healed collagen from yesterday's tears. The accumulation is additive. Each day's repair cycle begins before the previous day's has finished, and the resulting tissue is denser, stiffer, and more disorganized than either the original fascia or a single repair event would have produced. Disorganized collagen is stiffer than organized collagen. Scar tissue is stiffer than the fascia it replaced. Scar tissue is stiffer than the original. Stretching vigorously every morning on gelled tissue progressively replaces flexible, aligned fascia with stiff, disorganized scar tissue. The morning stretch that relieves stiffness for 20 minutes is creating the conditions for tomorrow's stiffness to be worse. The cycle compounds. Tear, repair with stiff tissue, experience more stiffness tomorrow, stretch more aggressively, tear more tissue, repair with more scar. The person who has been stretching aggressively every morning for 10 years has more scar tissue in their fascial system than the person who stopped stretching and started moving gently. Invisibility is the cycle's protection. The relief is real. 20 minutes of improved mobility after aggressive stretching feels like evidence that the stretching worked. The micro tears feel like nothing. They are too small to register as acute pain. The scar tissue deposition takes days to complete. The stiffness increase it produces is attributed to aging, to weather, to sleeping wrong. Nobody connects the morning stretch to the afternoon's reduced range because the timeline between cause and effect is measured in days and the improvement after stretching is measured in minutes. The short-term signal, relief, drowns out the long-term signal, progressive scarring. What does the scar tissue accumulation feel like after 5 years of daily morning stretching on gelled tissue? It feels like aging, gradually reduced range of motion, increasing morning stiffness duration. The loosening period becomes 30, becomes 45. The fascial system has accumulated years of repaired tissue from a daily routine that tears what it should melt. The stiffness that worsened each year was the compounding scar, not the aging joint. The stiffness that prompted the stretching was a reversible state change in a lubricant, a change that required a minute of shear to reverse, not 10 minutes of tensile force applied to tissue that had not been primed to accept it. The stretching converted a reversible fluid problem, solvable in the initial shear window, into an irreversible structural one that compounds with every repetition. And then, the age dimension compounds the physics. Hyaluronic acid production declines with age repetition. And then, the age dimension estimates from dermatological and connective tissue research suggest a reduction of approximately 30 to 40% by age 60. The meaner age less lubricant between the fascial layers to begin with. What remains gels faster because the concentration is higher relative to the available water. A thicker starting solution reaches gel consistency at a higher temperature than a dilute one, and the gelled lubricant takes longer to reliquefy because the higher concentration means more molecular bonds must be broken before the fluid flows. The 50-year-old's fascia gels at a slightly higher temperature than the 30-year-old's. The 65-year-old's fascia gels faster, harder, and requires more shear to melt. The morning stiffness worsens with age through a mechanism that has nothing to do with joint degeneration, arthritis, or structural decline. It worsens because the lubricant supply decreases while the gel threshold increases. Compounding is relentless. Every year past 50, the fasciacytes produce slightly less hyaluronic acid. Every year the overnight gel sets slightly harder. Every year the morning takes slightly longer to loosen up. The trajectory is so gradual that it presents as normal aging, the slow reduction in morning mobility attributed to wear and tear rather than to a lubricant that is declining in volume and increasing in overnight viscosity. A 70-year-old who takes 45 minutes to get going in the morning may have adequate joint health, adequate muscle strength, adequate cardiovascular fitness, and a fascial lubrication system operating at 60% of its 30-year-old capacity. The stiffness is the lubricant between the soft tissues that wrap the skeleton, a lubricant that is declining in production, increasing in overnight viscosity, and responding to a thixotropic shear protocol that most people have never been taught. The distinction determines whether the solution is surgical, a joint replacement for a problem that was never in the joint, or a minute of gentle oscillation applied to a lubricant that was never defective, only gelled. If the lubricant production declines with age, does the melting sequence change, or does the same shear window still reverse the state change? Sequence remains the same. The physics does not change with age. Thixotropy operates on the same principles at 65 as at 30. What changes is the intensity required. A 30-year-old's fascia may reliquefy in 30 seconds of gentle movement. A 65-year-old's fascia, with less hyaluronic acid, higher gel concentration, more bonds to break, may need the full shear window or slightly longer. The protocol adjusts in duration, not in kind. The initial mobilization at 30 may become 90 seconds at 70. The physics is identical. The input requirement scales with the lubricant concentration. Well, the walking discussion described the same thixotropic physics inside joints. This is the identical fluid dynamics operating between fascial layers. A different compartment but the same requirement for mechanical shear to thin a gelled lubricant. Every gliding surface in the body, joint, fascial, visceral, uses the same thixotropic physics and responds to the same mechanical input. Recognition earns its final precision here. The stiffness that loosens after the first 5 minutes of walking every morning, the gradual easing that you attributed to warming up or working through the stiffness, is the thixotropic transition. You have been experiencing the gel to liquid state change every morning of your life without knowing the physics underneath it. The warming up was literal. The walking generated interfascial shear and frictional heat simultaneously, and the combination liquefied the gelled hyaluronic acid between your fascial layers. The physics was operating. You described it accurately. It takes me a few minutes to get going. You were right. The language was accurate. The few minutes were the time required for the thixotropic state change to complete. The gel bonds breaking under the shear of walking, the frictional heat raising tissue temperature, the lubricant thinning from adhesive to oil. What the 7 signals discussion described was sustained fascial tension as a signal the nervous system interprets and responds to. The morning provides the signal at its most concentrated, every fascial layer gelled, every surface adhered, every gliding plane locked. The timing of the mechanical input that releases the tension determines whether the tissue mobilizes or tears. 60 seconds of gentle oscillatory movement before any stretch converts the outcome from micro-trauma to mobilization. The same tissue, the same body, the same morning. Different physics depending entirely on what the first minute contains. Morning, I caught the difference most clearly. A Tuesday in March, cold bedroom, body stiff from 8 hours on my left side. The routine had been 10 minutes of stretching from the moment my feet hit the floor. Hamstrings, hip flexors, shoulders, spinal rotation, hard pulls into end range on tissue that resisted every centimeter. The relief lasted until I sat down for breakfast. By the time I stood up from the table, the stiffness had returned, identical, as though the stretching had never happened. That Tuesday I tried the alternative. 1 minute standing beside the bed, lateral sway, hips shifting side to side, spine following passively, torso rotation, gentle twists, arms hanging loose, hip circles, small orbits through the pelvis, no stretch, no pull, no end range. Pure oscillation, no destination, no end range, just continuous motion at the lowest amplitude that produced movement through the fascial system. After the melting interval, I attempted the same hamstring stretch that had produced grinding resistance 10 minutes earlier. The tissue yielded, the stretch was smooth and the range was full. The difference between the two mornings was sequence, whether the lubricant had been melted before the tissue was asked to stretch. Same body, same age, same bedroom temperature, same sleeping posture. Different first minute. The variable that determined the outcome was the smallest variable in the equation. A second morning confirmed what the first suggested. Same cold bedroom. Same left side sleeping posture. Same stiff geography. Left hip, lower back, left shoulder. The melting interval. Same smooth stretch. But this time I paid attention to the breakfast test, whether the stiffness returned after the initial sitting period. It did not return in the same way. The 20-minute sitting stiffness was present, but lighter. A mild gel reformation rather than the full overnight adhesion. The fascia had been sheared cleanly rather than torn, and the clean shear left the tissue surfaces smoother than the torn surfaces had been after aggressive stretching. The lubricant regelled during breakfast, as it always will. Thixotropy is reversible, but the starting point was different. Clean surfaces regel lightly. The hyaluronic acid reforms its weak bonds between smooth fascial planes. Scarred surfaces regel heavily. The disorganized collagen from years of micro-tears creates an irregular surface that traps more gel and resists subsequent shearing. The sequence determines everything. 2 inputs immediately upon waking. First, 250 milliliters of warm water, comfortably warm, not hot. The warm fluid enters systemic circulation, contributing to core temperature recovery and rehydrating the hyaluronic acid that lost water content during overnight transepidermal and respiratory water loss. Approximately 300 to 500 milliliters lost over a typical night through breathing, transepidermal evaporation, and urinary concentration. The hyaluronic acid molecules that form the interfascial lubricant are hygroscopic. They bind water molecules along their polymer chain, and the water content directly influences viscosity. Dehydrated hyaluronic acid is more viscous than hydrated hyaluronic acid at the same temperature. The warm water serves a dual thermal and hydration function, raising core temperature toward daytime levels while rehydrating the polymer chains that lost water content overnight. Second, 60 seconds of continuous gentle movement before any stretch. Stand at the bedside or sit at the mattress edge. Lateral sway, shift weight side to side, letting the hips and spine follow. Torso rotation, gentle twists, arms hanging relaxed. Hip circles, small circular motion through the pelvis. Spinal undulation, gentle flexion and extension, cat and cow without a yoga mat. The movement is low amplitude, continuous and oscillatory. Speed, slow, intensity, minimal. The goal is shear, not exercise. The fascial layers are being slid past one another. Each lateral sway shifts the thoracolumbar fascia over the erector spinae by millimeters. Each torso rotation slides the oblique fascia over the transversus abdominis. Each hip circle moves the iliotibial band over the vastus lateralis. The movements are small enough that no fascial layer is being asked to elongate. The demand is translational, not tensile. The frictional heat generated by this interfascial sliding raises local tissue temperature by fractions of a degree, but fractions of a degree matter in a system where the gel transition operates on a non-linear temperature curve. After the melting interval, the hyaluronic acid has re-liquefied. The fascia can glide. Stretch now. The tissue accepts elongation because the lubricant permits sliding rather than tearing. The same hamstring stretch that produced grinding resistance before the melting interval will produce smooth, full-range elongation after it. The difference is not in the stretch. The difference is in the state of the lubricant at the moment the stretch begins. Medical framing: anyone with acute inflammatory joint conditions, active rheumatoid arthritis flare, gout in an affected joint, should avoid mechanical loading during active inflammation and follow rheumatologist guidance on morning mobility. The thixotropic shear protocol applies to non-inflammatory morning stiffness, the kind that resolves within 20 to 30 minutes of movement. Inflammatory stiffness persists for hours and responds to anti-inflammatory treatment rather than mechanical input. The distinction matters. If the stiffness has not improved after 30 minutes of gentle movement, the mechanism may be inflammatory rather than thixotropic, and the appropriate response is medical evaluation rather than additional shear. Tomorrow morning, the stiffness will arrive. The same geography: the hip, the back, the ankles, the shoulders. The gel will have formed in the same places it always forms, driven by the same temperature drop and the same overnight stillness. The tissue will resist the first movement the same way it always resists. What changes is what happens in the first shear window. Whether the gel lubricant is sheared into liquid before the tissue is asked to stretch, whether the glide returns before the pull begins, whether the fascial layers slide past one another or tear against one another. The tissue was never damaged by sleep. The lubricant was never defective. It performed exactly as its physics predicts, gelling when temperature and shear disappeared, liquefying when they returned. The sequence was the variable, whether the body's first demand on the fascial system was a tensile pull on gelled tissue or an oscillatory shear that converted the gel to liquid before the pull began. Every morning you have ever woken stiff, the physics was the same. Every morning the stiffness loosened after 5 minutes of walking. The thixotropic transition was completing. Every morning the stretching provided temporary relief before the stiffness returned. The micro tears were healing with tissue stiffer than what they replaced. The physics was always operating. Every single morning, the explanation was always available. In the fluid dynamics of a lubricant, in the material science of a gel, in the biomechanics of a tissue that needs to slide before it can stretch. The morning was never the problem. The first minute was always the variable, and the tissue was always waiting for shear before stretch.